Greetings and welcome to another segment of Reading the Fundamentals with me, Professor Stephanie Johnson, also known as the WRITE, the Right Professor. I started this project, Reading the Fundamentals, in an effort to, if you will, rekindle, reignite, to inflame, to charge up a passion for reading, and not just for reading anything, but reading the canonical works of any body of literature. Now, we know that many of us enjoy reading, what we want to read about things that we like. And we also need to make sure that we stay in tune and in touch with the foundational literature that helped shape our country and shape our world. I started this project in July, first as a celebration of American independence. For that, I decided to read an excerpt from The Soul of Black Folk. I read the section on double consciousness, and we know that particular work was written by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Then the second segment of Reading the Fundamentals focused on a breaking story in early July when the living quarters of Sarah Sally Hemings were discovered by archaeologists at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. The third segment of my show focused on Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, when every enslaved person in America was finally made free down in Galveston, Texas. For that, I celebrated by reading an excerpt from Paul Laurence Dunbar's An Antebellum Sermon. And that was so much fun because remember, Paul Laurence Dunbar loved to write using the Black vernacular. Now, episode 4 was also lit. Episode 4 was an ode to Dr. Umar Johnson's appearance on News One Now with Roland Martin. Dr. Umar Johnson came on the scene and began sharing his Pan-Africanist views, and a lot of people, I could tell, did not know what in the world he was talking about. So I decided to read an excerpt from a poem by Dudley Randall written in 1969 entitled Booker T and W.E.B. And in that reading, we were reminded of the dichotomy of perspectives between those two great scholars. But not only the dichotomy that exists, but the different ideologies and philosophies that exist about how to move the African American race forward in America and the Black race forward in the entire world. So that was so fun to read as well. Now, episode 5 of Reading the Fundamentals was dedicated to the month of July being Uterine Fibroids Awareness Month. As a survivor of uterine fibroids, I decided to take a moment and to read a work entitled Strangers in Peoria, written by Donal Mahoney. And this story was very important because it allows the audience to see some of the struggles that women have with uterine fibroids. So now we're at episode 6. Episode 6 will be the beginning of another series in Reading the Fundamentals. The first portion so far has focused on BLit, Black literature, and WomLit for women's literature. Now I'm going to read an excerpt from a story in the genre of Christian literature. So that series will be entitled ChristLit. Yay! Now, in this first episode dedicated to ChristLit, I'll be reading the story of a martyr by the name of Thomas Hauker, and that story is entitled I Have to Know. This story of Thomas Hauker is featured in a compilation of stories that were put together in a book entitled Jesus Freaks. And Jesus Freaks was compiled by a group by the name of DC Talk, whose mission as a band was to help prepare Christians in the last days for Christ's return. Now, the title of the book, Jesus Freaks, refers to martyrs. Martyrs are people who give the ultimate sacrifice for what they believe in. So martyrs, or Christian martyrs, are those who have paid the ultimate price for their belief in Jesus Christ. They paid the price of giving their life. If you have professed to be a Christian, no matter your race, color, creed, or kind, would you give your life for Christ? Would you allow your culture to supersede your decision to follow Christ? Would you let fear stop you from giving your life for Christ? Have you thought about that? These are definitely questions to ask yourself. Thomas Hauker was so enamored with Jesus Christ and so committed to his relationship with him that when asked to stop preaching the gospel, he refused that request. He continued to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. So much so, he was imprisoned and set for execution to be burned at the stake. Here is his story. I have to know. Thomas. His friend lowered his voice so as not to be heard by the guard. I have to ask you this favor. I need to know if what others say about the grace of God is true. Tomorrow, when they burn you at the stake, if the pain is tolerable and your mind is still at peace, lift your hands above your head. Do it right before you die. Thomas, I have to know. Thomas Hauker whispered to his friend, I will. The next morning, Hauker was bound to the stake and the fire was lit. The fire burned a long time, but Hauker remained motionless. His skin was burnt to a crisp and his fingers were gone. Everyone watching supposed he was dead. Suddenly, miraculously, Hauker lifted his hands, still on fire, over his head. He reached them up to the living God and then, with great rejoicing, clapped them together 3 times. The people there broke into shouts of praise and applause. Hauker's friend had his answer. Stories of martyrs are fundamental to Christian literature. Why? Because of the ultimate martyr story, Jesus Christ himself, who gave his life for what he believed in. Not only that, the first recorded Christian martyr also appears in the Bible in the person of Stephen, who believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ and preached it in the face of adversity, and he too was executed. He was stoned to death. So Thomas Hauker's story is similar to Stephen's. Stephen preached and prayed and praised God through being stoned. Martyr stories are important to us today because it's still happening in places around the world. There are Christians who cannot worship freely and out in the open, and there are Christians who are still dying for their beliefs in Christ. So maybe you live in the part of the world where believing in Christ does not place you in a life or death situation, but it could happen at any time. We're living in a time in history where there's terrorism and there's wars and rumors of wars. You can think about that in 2 ways. Different ways of stretching our faith, whether we do or not. Sometimes we die spiritual deaths because we just simply do not stretch our faith enough as Christians. And then as time progresses, as the world continues to change and Bible prophecies are being fulfilled, there may come a time in history, in the future, and in future history, where Christians will be martyred in large numbers as we wait for Christ's second coming. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode of Reading the Fundamentals. I am your host, Professor Stephanie D. Johnson, also known as The Write, W-R-I-T-E Professor. It's always a pleasure to share with you, and never forget, reading is lit.